Western diplomats operate on a specific premise when analyzing the Middle East, that a workable majority in the region want lasting peace with Israel, and that the hurdles are strictly political, like drawing borders and forming governments. This premise has driven every major diplomatic effort of the last half-century. We saw it at the Camp David summit, and it was the foundation of the Oslo Accords. More recently, agreements between governments, like the 2020 Abraham Accords, make it look like this assumption is correct, and that regional normalization is steadily advancing. But there is a massive gap between what governments sign and what their citizens actually believe. Polling data from 2025 and 2026 reveals that popular, attitudinal support for normalization among citizens in these frontline countries is effectively zero. When peace treaties exist strictly on paper between state officials and are rejected by the public, the diplomatic framework relying on those treaties is operating on a factual error. To determine the actual geopolitical trajectory of the Middle East, we have to look past diplomatic optimism and examine the hard data. And that requires analyzing three specific metrics: classical Islamic jurisprudence, the latest public opinion polling, and regional military spending. These localized metrics provide a more accurate timeline for regional stability than international treaty signatures do. The required starting point is theology. For millions of observant traditionalists in the Middle East, religious obligation is not a supplement to their politics. It is the absolute foundation of how they reason about land and governance. In this context, classical doctrine must be analyzed as a hard structural constraint on statecraft, rather than a privatized personal belief system. The Western model treats land sovereignty as a secular issue, transferable by contract. Traditional Islamic jurisprudence operates entirely differently, relying on a doctrine called Waqf. A Waqf is an inalienable religious endowment. Any territory historically governed by Islamic authority enters a permanent divine trust. Because modern Israel and Palestine were governed by Islamic caliphates for centuries, they fall strictly under this Waqf designation. This creates a strict territorial constraint. For an observant traditionalist, the difference between the 1948 borders, the 1967 lines, or a future two-state solution is irrelevant. The doctrine dictates that no Waqf land can ever be permanently ceded to non-Muslim governance. This is the mainstream scholarly consensus. Major institutions like Egypt's Al-Azhar University consistently uphold this Waqf doctrine regarding Palestinian territory. Therefore, if a Muslim leader signs a permanent peace treaty that gives up Waqf territory, they are not making a political compromise. Under traditional jurisprudence, they are committing a direct theological betrayal. To see how this theological framework translates into public opinion, we evaluate the regional survey data. This table shows the 2025-2026 Arab Opinion Index. In frontline states like Egypt, Jordan, and Libya, opposition to recognizing Israel sits between 94 and 96%. This falls within the polling error margin. It is a statistical consensus, not a simple majority. The numbers are even starker in Saudi Arabia, where 99% of surveyed citizens described normalization as a negative step. Saudi Arabia is a highly connected, economically modernized nation with extensive global ties. A 99% opposition rate there is driven by deep, persistent conviction, not a lack of access to outside information. Egypt has maintained a formal peace treaty with Israel since 1979 and Jordan since 1994. Yet decades later, their populations overwhelmingly reject recognition. Formal agreements between governments have completely failed to produce attitudinal normalization among their citizens. The treaties exist strictly at the state level. The Middle East is currently operating under a Hudna framework. The absence of active war is a strategic interval. It is not a final resolution. A Hudna is governed by a strict decision calculus. The truce lasts as long as the cost of active conflict is too high, and the military means to achieve the objective are too low. This brings us to military investment. We can look at regional defense budgets, specifically Iran's 2026 allocations, to see if that means variable is shifting. This chart tracks Iran's defense spending. In 2026, Iran increased its defense budget by 145% over the previous year. This capital is not being spent on conventional territorial defense. The increases are concentrated in offensive projection capabilities, ballistic missiles, drone production, and electronic warfare. These are the exact weapon systems required to strike targets at a distance and project force outward. This map illustrates Iran's secondary strategic investment, its proxy network. By supplying groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, the Houthis in Yemen, and Shia militias in Iraq, Iran distributes the cost of conflict. This network functions as a force multiplier, actively disrupting regional security while giving the central state a degree of plausible deniability. This extreme concentration of offensive capital shows that regional actors are systematically preparing the military means to eventually resume conflict. When we combine the data, the timeline clarifies. Theology provides the unyielding motive, but the reality for Western policymakers is clear. Continuously confusing a temporary Hudna for a permanent sulh leads to severely miscalibrated security frameworks. Diplomatic proposals that only remove weapons without addressing the underlying theological convictions do not solve the conflict. They just reset the timer on the truce. The only viable path to lasting stability is internal theological and cultural reform within Muslim-majority societies. There are voices within those communities arguing for new interpretations that allow for coexistence, but supporting them is generational work. It cannot be forced or negotiated by external Western powers. Until that internal shift occurs, honest statecraft requires abandoning the illusion of imminent normalization and preparing for the realities of a long-horizon strategic pause.